Julia, I think we can start anytime you'd like.
Great. Welcome everyone to this exciting panel discussion. My name is Julia Goren. I am director of the Vision 2050 project for the Adirondack Council. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to start with some logistics and also set the stage for this conversation. So first of all, I am excited to know that we have questions rolling in and have had questions before today's discussion has even started. Please make sure as you're posting that you post your questions in the Q&A. We will not be monitoring the chat during the presentation. So if you want to use the chat to say hi to your friends, feel free to do so. But if you want to ask a question, please make sure you put it in the Q&A. The questions and answers will be posted afterwards on the ARC website. In addition, I just wanted to acknowledge we are talking about the high peaks, we're talking about research, we're talking about visitors, and when we are talking about these issues, we draw a great deal of interest and attention. This is a hot button topic, and it's exciting to see so many folks joining the conversation today. There has been a lot in the news recently about the release of the High Peaks Advisory Group report, and I want to encourage folks to go and read the report so you can find out what's in that report yourself. I would like to thank the DEC and the APA for being part of the Wilderness Overuse Working Group and for embracing and supporting the recommendations in that report, including that of the Visitor Use Management Framework, knowing that it is a process with 14 different steps and that it calls for transparency and calls for an independent facilitator. I also want to thank the ARC both for hosting today's discussion and for their willingness to accept funds supplemental to what the DEC and APA would otherwise have for the Visitor Use Management Framework. So thank you to them. Now, before I introduce our panelists today, I just want to point out that we are hearing about research, and we are hearing about two different research projects with very different goals. Dr. Heidi Kretser from the Wildlife Conservation Society is a conservation social scientist with the Global Conservation Program. Heidi improves the conservation of wildlife and wildlands by incorporating tools and perspectives from the social sciences into conservation practice. In addition to her role at WCS, Heidi serves as an adjunct associate professor at Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and is affiliated with the Cornell Center for Conservation Social Sciences. She also serves on the board of the Adirondack Land Trust, and she completed her PhD in Natural Resource Policy and Management at Cornell and has a master's of Environmental Studies from Yale School of Forestry. Heidi's work with WCS was actually a project that was planned before COVID, and it focuses on balancing visitor use and conservation. And Heidi will be presenting her work first, and then we'll have a brief moment or two for questions, and then we'll go to Dr. Jill Weiss. Jill is the Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at SUNY ESF. Her recent research includes a long-term study of alpine stewardship and hiker trends in the Northeast United States, and some may recognize her name as being part of the High Peaks Advisory Group. Jill's work with ESF was something that came together, and she'll speak about this as a partnership this summer, and it was really focused on characterizing recreational users, learning about their preparation, and hiker perspectives on management, addressing user capacity in COVID times. So with that, I will turn it over to Heidi.
Great, thank you, Julia, for moderating today. I'm going to share my screen. Thumbs up that you can all see the screen. Yes, okay, great. Thanks to the Adirondack Research Consortium for putting on these series of really great webinars that have been going on throughout the month of March. So I'm really excited to share some of the preliminary results from our work last summer and fall. And I'd like to start out by giving a little bit of an overview of the context of doing this work. And then I'll shift to what we actually did, and finally share some of my preliminary results. So across the country and also around the world, scenes such as these on your screen are commonplace, where more and more people are heading to protected areas for a whole variety of reasons: to get outdoors, for exercise, to seek solitude, to be with family and friends. And in many places, getting people to these places and enjoying the outdoors is an explicit objective of organizations to help increase the connection of people to nature, with the hope that maybe they will someday somehow contribute something back to conservation more broadly, whether it be in that place directly or someplace else. But many protected areas have this dual mandate for both public enjoyment and to protect species. So one might ask, can we really achieve both conservation and enjoyment of these resources with the current and future levels of visitation? There was a paper in 2016, it was a review paper that looked at what little research at that time had been done investigating the impacts of recreation on wildlife. And they found a strong negative impacts across a variety of geographic contexts and different types of recreation activities, particularly the impacts of non-motorized recreation on wildlife. When this article was written up in the New York Times, it was actually the comments that provided a window into people's appetites for thinking that what they were doing in the great outdoors could be negative to wildlife. Like, for example, having hiked more than a few times, I've noticed that I tend to disturb birds. Somehow, I still find a way to sleep at night. So with these kinds of sentiments, we started to think, and we were quite interested in how we might balance visitation and conservation in protected areas in a way that can serve to engage recreationists in protection of the very lands that they are there to experience. So my colleagues, Dr. Michaeli Glennon, myself, another colleague, Sarah Reed, and I proposed a study on the dynamic human environmental interactions in the context of recreation, asking the question, what is the effect of people on protected areas? And what is the effect of protected areas on people? And that would lead us to questions that are related to the management of crowds. So what context of a protected area visit leads to people actually wanting to take some sort of pro-conservation behavior? And in practical terms, can we actually convert the energy and the desire to be outside with actions that will actually benefit a place? Of course, as we all know, the Adirondacks is a very interesting place to investigate such an issue. Data as far back as the 80s and the 90s show a demonstrable increase in recreation of all types. In this decade alone, our own attempts through our own research to use forest preserve lands as a control site for a study that we had been doing on private lands resulted in a completely inadvertent recreation study, where in fact we did find negative impacts to wildlife from recreation. So we neatly packed all of our ideas into a fancy NSF theoretical model with an experimental design, and we were ready to implement both some ecological and social research methods last summer when COVID hit and, of course, threatened to thwart everything. But as we all know, nobody needs to fear. The droves of people kept coming. And I'm sure we all experienced it live at some point last summer. We were trying to enjoy the forest preserve. So I'm happy to say that we successfully implemented our entire study, including doing hiker intercept surveys. We used a Kobo toolbox on tablets at trailheads. We also deployed camera traps and acoustic monitors for ecological monitoring along the trail. And in quick fashion, we added a component to look specifically at people who came hiking in the Adirondacks because of COVID. So we intercepted over 1,600 hikers at 33 trailheads in the Northern Adirondacks. Of those, 65% agreed to participate. Some of them were then put into a control group where they did just the pre and the post survey. Some received some kind of educational treatment. We were talking with them, and others were asked to partake in a very simple and an extremely modified, for COVID safety reasons, citizen science project, which was really amounted to taking photos of what they perceived to be high and low quality along the trail, high and low quality habitat along the trail. Of those agreeing to participate, 60% actually completed the final post-hike survey for a total of 629 participants who completed the entire study. Before I dive into my findings, I just wanted to point out that as part of a larger effort to coordinate across the individuals and groups interested in collecting data about hikers in the Adirondacks, the High Peaks Advisory Group organized some meetings last spring of those that were planning or thinking about conducting surveys. And we all recognize that organizations obtain their funds for surveys from different places, and we all have different goals. And so we discussed a need or an opportunity for shared questions that anyone from the group would be encouraged to use, such that we could kind of compare across our studies and our different efforts. Asking for zip codes of respondents is one of those questions. And although I personally and my group we haven't actually done much with our zip code data, I did want to just flash this quite crude map up because I know Jill is actually going to share some of her zip code data in a much more beautiful fashion. So I thought it would be nice for you to see this map, and then you can kind of take a little photographic memory of it and see that work. Because I think you'll see as we go along in our talk, there are some questions that really complement each other nicely. I also wanted to point out that it's really cool that we have this data for 2020 in the middle of this pandemic, and it will be very interesting to see how it changes as restrictions loosen up. Notably, we have nobody from Canada. And that border is going to open before this next season, it seems like. Okay, so now I'll focus on sharing some of the data from the 1,000 participants that answered only our pre-hike survey. Specifically, looking at the 20% who indicated that they would not be hiking in the Adirondacks had COVID not occurred. We asked where people obtained their information about the trail they were hiking. So not only were COVID hikers here because of the viral pandemic, they were also using online resources. So you can see from this chart that some of the individuals were getting their information from friends and family. That tended to be more the non-COVID hikers or from personal experience. But it's those COVID hikers who were going to the online resources, specifically All Trails, which is a hiking app that also seems to have gone viral. From our experience in the field, we know that many of these individuals were only using their phones with All Trails, which of course has implications for emergency services. And I'll also note that we added the All Trails app 4 weeks after data collection because it was completely overwhelming our other category. We also asked all of the hikers to self-evaluate their knowledge. And we asked them, in addition to their self-evaluation, we asked them 11 questions that were specific to identifying common Adirondack wildlife and rules and regs about wildlife. And what we found was that COVID hikers, and this is not that surprising, were less knowledgeable about the Adirondacks. But I will point out that at 6.46 mean, 6.89 mean out of this possible score of 11, overall knowledge was a little bit on the low side. We were kind of surprised. We also included measures of place attachment or the bonding of a person to a particular location. And these are statements that have been tested throughout literature and other geographic locations. And we found, again, unsurprising, that COVID hikers were less attached to the Adirondacks, which will have implications. We also found that COVID hikers were less likely to engage in pro-conservation behaviors specific to the Adirondacks. Note that all of these behaviors had a significant difference except for buying environmentally friendly products, which is good because that's a non-Adirondack specific behavior, and we expected both groups to engage equally. Okay. So, and here's a little shift. Just kind of like a sampler of the pre and post. Again, the post survey, we had about 629 people who finished that completely. Of those, 143 were COVID hikers, and 477 roughly were non-COVID hikers. And in this slide, we compare from when people took the pre-test to when they took the post-test, how they indicated they would engage in the pro-conservation behaviors. So to orient you a little bit to this slide, note that, again, the COVID hikers are on the left and the non-COVID hikers are on the right. And each has a pre-hike and a post-hike means displayed in their columns. And those means are on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being very unlikely to engage in the behavior and 7 being very likely to engage. The boxes that have the green show in the post column show an increase in the means of that behavior, and the boxes that are blue show a decrease. And then significance, of course, is noted in with the superscript. So our preliminary analysis suggests that post-hike intentions to engage in pro-conservation behaviors increased less among COVID hikers. So they're less likely to have gone on a hike and then say, oh yeah, now I really want to do something that will benefit the Adirondacks. So that's of interest. And I would say across the board, engagement in pro-conservation behaviors related to the Adirondacks specifically is a little bit on the low side. For non-COVID hikers and also individuals who know more about the Adirondacks and have more attachment to this place, that's the hikers, the non-COVID hikers, they were more likely to indicate that they would be more likely to engage in like posting on social media, volunteering on trail improvement, and contacting state and federal legislatures. So it all kind of relates to each other, the knowledge, the attachment, people who have been here and hike here, they might be more likely to convert their energy into doing some of these conservation, pro-conservation behaviors. So we still have a lot of data to work through, but I did want to give another little preliminary insight into 2 areas of inquiry. The first is the perceptions of hikers and individual impacts on the trails and on wildlife, and support for management actions that we think, based on our past research on the impacts of recreation on wildlife, could benefit wildlife. So just 2 more data slides. First, let's look at the perception of impacts. This is a question that we asked only on the post-hike survey, so we don't have a basis for comparing it to a pre-hike survey. But we asked people, how severe do you believe the impacts are of hikers on local trails and hikers on wildlife, and your individual activities on local trails and your individual activities on wildlife? Again, we're reporting the means with 1 being not at all severe and 7 being very severe. So in this case, we found no difference between COVID and non-COVID hikers, really. There was a small one, but it was relatively negligible. But look at how the respondents from both groups view the impacts of hikers on trails and wildlife compared to their individual activities. Our respondents generally did not perceive that what they were doing as an individual would have as much impact as hikers in general. So we would definitely like to dig a little bit more into this question to see how we might explain this. And it could be as simple as people evaluating the impact of the one, they're just themselves, versus the impact of the many, like the full group of hikers. This type of finding is also prevalent in environmental literature when you're thinking of like, what's my impact if I'm doing recycling, or if I'm my contribution to climate change, or different things. People tend to think like my own little individual impact isn't going to be very much. So next, in addition to asking about pro-environmental behaviors, we asked about the likelihood of supporting management actions that we believe, meaning Michaela and my collaborators, would be wildlife-friendly actions that managers could take. We asked these questions in the pre-hike and the post-hike, so again, we could compare the answers, how the answers changed. And again, orienting you to the slide, it's similar to the previous more complicated slide with the COVID hikers on the left and the non-COVID hikers on the right, with the pre-hike and the post-hike means displayed. Again, the green in the post-hike column indicates an increase, the blue boxes indicates a decrease. And overall, we found that hikers are generally likely to support management actions across the board, with most of the support being for rerouting of trails and closing of sensitive areas. Limiting the number of hikers and creating a permit system received less support, but still respondents were more likely to support those actions than not support those actions. I did want to note that supporting that the support for prohibiting hiking in certain areas increased the most between pre and post hike surveys. And support for rerouting of trails decreased the most. We don't know what that means. There could be kind of a lot of explanations in there, and that would be something to look into. So we do want to revisit this question based on our sampling of trails representation. We actually tried to sample some trails that were more high intensity use and some that were low intensity use. So we want to see if there's any differences in this support for management based on that. So in spite of it all, this COVID field season was surprisingly worked out very well for us, including that we collected data that supports our underlying social theory for the whole project, that individuals with more knowledge and more place attachment are more likely to engage in pro-conservation behaviors in that place, and vice versa. Those with less knowledge, less place attachment are less likely to engage in pro-conservation behaviors. That was clearly evident among the COVID hikers. So we also have some interesting data from year one to explore with regard to our perceptions of impacts, as well as support for management, actions, trail use intensity, and other motivations for hiking. And of course, then we have this like droves and droves of ecological data, and you can talk to Michaela Glennon about that. I'm sure she would be excited to hear from you. But we're hopefully going to get that organized and analyzed. So stay tuned for more outcomes after we complete season 2 and analyze the data. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heidi. I think we will we'll go to Jill, and then we'll have some time. I see. Thank you, folks, for posting questions in the Q&A. We'll come back to these questions.
Can I go ahead and share my screen? Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you see it. Fantastic. First of all, Heidi, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. Now I want to meet with you and talk about some stuff because I've got a lot of ideas all of a sudden. The goals of this presentation are really just to share out some findings, preliminary findings. I have students that have ownership in this work, and they're still working on some of the more complicated statistical analyses. This is a presentation of an in-kind partnership between the Adirondack Council, SUNY ESF, and the Adirondack Mountain Club, known as RU-ADK 2020, Recreational User Experience and Perspectives, Adirondack Park. And I'm Dr. Jill Weiss, and I'm here from ESF. Hello. And I know a lot of the people who are on the call, so I really wish I could see you in person. I don't want to go any further without telling you how special this partnership is, how unusual it is, and how it would not have happened if it weren't for the Adirondack High Peaks Strategic Planning Advisory Group and COVID happening kind of at the same time. In HPAG, I worked very closely with Rocky Aguirre, who at that time was with the Adirondack Council, and Seth Jones, who was with the Adirondack Mountain Club. And what we were concerned about in general is how much anecdotal stories and quote unquote data is kind of shoved around in these discussions of management of the Adirondacks, and how little data is being collected about who the hikers are. And based on my research over the past 10 years and hikers across the Northeast, hikers are changing. They're not hiking for the same reasons that maybe people did 10 years ago. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's very hard to manage them and manage the areas and protect the ecology if we don't quite know what's going on. So, but COVID happened, and that meant funding opportunities for myself and the Adirondack Mountain Club, and to some extent the Adirondack Council, just evaporated. I was not able to travel. My students were not able to travel, but there was a silver lining. Seth Jones at the Adirondack Mountain Club said he might have an extra staff person, and the Adirondack Council had 2 staff people funded for the summer, Ryan Nerp and Carolyn Dodd, and along with Maggie Newell at the Adirondack Mountain Club were available for collecting data. What's even more exciting is that ESF and Syracuse University stepped up and allowed these students, and not students, these staff and their supervisors to get social science research training. So they were able to take the city training, and I was able to train them on protocols remotely. And we decided to make a go of it in an incredibly short period of time. I'm sure the audience isn't aware that in regular grants and research, sometimes it takes years to plan a project. We kind of put this together between 5 and 7 weeks, which is kind of extraordinary. But there's some prices to pay with that. The purpose of this study is to characterize recreational users of the High Peaks area, learn about hiker planning, familiarity with the area and their information sources, gain hiker perspective on management practices that address user capacity, and right in our laps, we had this wonderful opportunity to ask a question about COVID-19, but it wasn't central. My experience before I became an academic was in practical world, and I have a lot of experience surveying populations in New York City, for example, that don't wish to be surveyed. So my philosophy is less questions, the better. So I wanted to keep the survey short to increase the chances that people would complete it on the spot. Where the framework comes from is that we wanted to occupy this space, this semi-practical space between academia and practical applications. And we also, some of the stuff that Heidi said actually matters for us too. Fishbein et al. Talk about if you can understand recreational users' beliefs, attitudes and opinions, intent and behavior, through observations, anecdotes, participatory processes, interviews, and surveys, you can better understand these things and possibly influence better behaviors, or at the very least, learn what opportunities there are for communication, education, and management. And really, hopefully, as also Heidi said, make the user a part of the solution. Our survey was informed by a lot of things, and we should all recognize there was a lot of pressure to get this completed in a very short period of time, and the partners had different goals. So it was a lot of negotiation, plus we also negotiated with the DEC because we needed the permits to do this research. So our surveys were informed by the interests of the partners, anecdotal information from local professionals, and public comment, and also data I've collected over the last 10 years at 10 different sites in 4 states, including the High Peaks, but also including Mount Monadnock, Baxter State Park, Mount Moosilauke, Franconia Notch, Green Mount, can't think of it, Mount Mansfield, and so on and so forth. Our population and recruitment strategy was also affected by COVID, staff experience, timing. So we decided we would choose popular areas in the High Peaks, and this actually supported the Adirondack Council's mission and the Adirondack Mountain Club's mission. And we used a purposive sample narrowed by location and randomization. We couldn't really frame the sample any further with the resources that we had. And because our sites were so different in character, we were really concerned about having a mismatch if we attempted to count all of the people versus the people that took the survey. At Heart Lake, for example, people are wandering kind of all over. It would be very difficult unless you funneled them to one spot, which isn't really allowed. And in some state lands, you're actually not allowed to really trap people. So we really went with the tabling method, which I've had success with in New York City. So we gave it a shot. And what we tried to do is make taking this survey as easy as possible. Using lots and lots of COVID safety protocols and PPE, as you can see here, Maggie's set up at Heart Lake. No contact, lots of PPE, the option to take the paper survey right then, but also we had bookmarks, as you can see here, that had a QR code so you could take it on your own device whenever you wanted. So people had the option again to take it on paper or take it online through the secure Qualtrics interface, which was pretty easy to do. So between August 5th and October 11th, 2020, 673 recreational users consented and completed our survey. Data was collected at 10 sites by Adirondack Council staff and at one site, Heart Lake, by Adirondack Mountain Club staff. Dates were selected randomly and then adjusted to not interfere with other research, such as Heidi and her team. There were a total of 29 data collection events occurring on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from about 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. So we did, I don't think we studied in the exact same places as Heidi, but we did have a little overlap in places. So who are these respondents? And this is what drives me. I am really concerned about hiker or recreational area management managing based on anecdote. We need to start finding out who the recreational users really are. And we can't just ask once. We have to ask lots of times in lots of different ways over a long period of time. And my philosophy is, why not now? Let's just start asking now. And that's kind of what we did. 69% of the respondents identified as hikers, followed by backcountry campers at 15% and peak challengers at 9%, rock climbing and trail running each at 1%. 48% of the folks are between the ages of 25 and 44. That might be because of COVID travel. And 92% identified as white. And I want actually to go back and look at this 9% and 1% because that's going to become important later. And thank you, Kayla, for sharing this photo from Vin Moresco. 59, as far as goals were concerned, 59% claimed they sought wilderness character and solitude. We did not provide a definition of that, but what this is to me is I can say to a grad student, run with this. This is interesting. Let's start asking people how they define wilderness, how they define solitude, and how that interfaces with the mission of the park, right? So this is gold as far as I'm concerned. And 13% said no. So we're going to go back, and if we were to look at how the hikers identified their activity, that correlates extremely well. If you are doing a peak challenge with a group, or you're trail running, or something else, you might be looking for solitude, but maybe not. Maybe there's something else going on there. And I think that that's why these questions are so exciting. The Adirondack Mountain Club worked very closely with the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics and really wanted us to find out just what the the awareness of LNT was. But this is another one. Almost everybody claimed they have no leaf trace principles. Now, as an environmental educator, I've tested people and they often claim that, but then when you test them on some of the principles, that doesn't come true. But again, now we have a research agenda. Now we can say, hey, let's take this question and run with it in another study. So this is, again, I'm very excited about this. And here's the fancy map that Heidi was talking about. And thanks to graduate student Delaney Demro for doing this for us. This is even fancier than the one I showed in the draft. I'll give you a close-up in a second. But through our research, we collected zip codes. And Heidi, you had a slightly different pattern. I'm really looking forward to working with you guys on with your data. But I'm seeing a corridor situation. People definitely traveled in pairs, and I do think that's because of COVID. Overwhelmingly, it was groups of two. And then I'm really seeing this 87 north-south and 90 east-west corridor. I'm really seeing that quite a bit. I'm also seeing, people staying kind of locally compared to traveling to the Rocky Mountains or traveling to Europe, right? People are going to take trips that are more close by, likely because of COVID. So what was the influence of COVID on the visit? This is where I have to admit our question crafting was not great. The question was easy to understand and people answered it, but it created a double negative. But what it amounts to is that about 10% reported that COVID-19 was a factor in making the trip at all. And an additional 5 and 6% neutral, not sure. That actually matches almost exactly with what Heidi and her team had, which is kind of exciting. And we should follow up about that. That's something we can talk about. One thing we're working on, just like Heidi did, we're trying to cross-tab, slice and dice, so to speak, between the different types of COVID users, experience, and then how they feel about different issues. We're just not ready to share that yet. Preparation, I'm going to go through these a little fast because I want to be sensitive to time. Most did a few weeks of planning. But 13% planned several months before, and I would suspect that's going to match up with people that would have hiked, whether there was COVID or not. These are the planners, right? And then 77% had visited the park between 1 and 5 times in the last year. To me, that might not mean super high experience, but it does mean experience. And then we have people that have that did write-ins and they've been to the park hundreds of times. So I want to assure our audience today that we weren't just getting newbies. We actually got a broad representation of types of hikers. New visitors, there were a lot of them, but we did hear from a lot of locals, and we did hear from a lot of experienced hikers that were not locals. This, I think we have overlap with Heidi and her team. While the majority cited previous experience as the driver for how they planned their trip, 28% used all trails alone or in combination with another source. I also want to point out that television wasn't selected at all. One anecdotal story I keep hearing in this region is that, oh, those ads, those tourism ads telling people to go to the Adirondacks on TV, it's terrible. Apparently nobody watches TV or plans because of TV, so we can actually put that to rest and leave those commercials alone. Well, we can do whatever you want, but I guess what I'm saying is we can't make claims about things if we don't have data. Maybe that's what I'm really here to say today. So preparation, 84% reported their sources were accurate, which is surprising because anecdotally across the Northeast, most of my colleagues say things like, oh, they used all trails and they were lost. Oh, they lost a phone signal and they had to be helicoptered out. That may be true. Those might have really happened, but it's not happening to most of the people. Most of the people are perfectly happy with their where they're getting their information. So if we as quote unquote experts don't necessarily feel that information is good enough, maybe we need to partner with All Trails. Maybe we need to partner with some of these sources and improve the quality of the information, and people will be even more satisfied and safer. So now we're getting into management actions. This is the home stretch of my talk. It was important to myself, the Adirondack Mountain Club, and especially the Adirondack Council to start asking these tough questions. We've been hedging because this is the kinds of questions that make the public a little bit irritated. But I will tell you that if we just base everything on public comment, remember to do public comment, you have to sign in, you have to write something up. Generally, the people who participate in public comment are very, very passionate and are very, very motivated to say what they're saying. And that is great. But that's a very specific megaphone. We need to kind of pair it with another group of people that isn't necessarily seeking to comment. So that's what these questions are about. And I don't know what they mean, but they do mean this needs to be studied some more. So let's start with parking. As you may or may not know, most of the roadway shoulder parking was made illegal in the past couple of seasons. So I ended up uncovering that about 210 people probably parked illegally in this study, but we didn't, of course, ask them that. So, but 52% were able to park in the lot that they had planned. 13% changed their plan when they couldn't park, and only 1% had no plan at all. That also goes against anecdotal chatter I've heard with my own colleagues that, oh, everybody's just coming without a plan. No, only 1% came without a plan in this study. And I think that says something. We got to give people some credit. Lot closures, this was pleasantly surprising. 57% claimed they would support temporary trailhead parking area closures when the lot reached capacity. 14% no. I wonder if I start matching up peak bagging or trail challengers or people doing best known times with that, like if they're there that day to do that peak or do that time, are they less willing to move to another spot, less willing to disperse? This is a great research agenda. This is a great thing to study next. I'm very excited about this. Parking permits. 50% claimed they would support a parking permit system that would guarantee a parking space, sorry about the typo, at trailhead on arrival. 23 said no way. And I want you to look at the not sure and the neutrals. And I think what that means is that people couldn't figure out how this would work. That's what that says to me, because I also struggle with how such a system would work. And so I think that's where the neutral or not sures came in. And then shuttle buses, of course, received a lot of support. I think the people that were neutral or not sure would probably never use a shuttle bus, so they didn't want to weigh in. And then temporary trail closures, I was actually very pleased to see this because, as Heidi said, a mission of a park is to give access and protect ecology. This is almost impossible, right? So, but 70% of these respondents said, okay, if conditions are such that we're going to damage the trail or we're going to hurt the ecology, I'm okay with closing this temporarily. And I thought that was kind of exciting. And access permits, probably one of the most contentious, and we're almost at the end of my show. 59% claimed they would support limited access permits, as we have in national parks, for example, to manage capacity in wilderness areas that are degrading. I also think that the neutral and the not sure have trouble imagining how it would work. Remember, Adirondack Park has people living in it. We cannot put a gate up on 73, no matter how badly some people want that to happen. It's actually a major truck route, and it's a 55-mile-an-hour zone. So we really, if we're going to do something like this, obviously take a lot more research and a lot more thought, but we have to stop saying that the public can't handle it at all, because clearly 59% of these respondents can handle it. What's next? Well, a few weeks ago, I got a 3-year McIntyre Stennis grant, which is significant, and I'll be getting additional researchers, and I'm going to take this show on the road. I already have 10 sites across the Northeast established. I'm going to be building on that work and this work, because guess what? There's well-loved trails everywhere, and we want to find out more about what hikers are thinking and feeling. We also want to remember that while the Adirondacks are incredibly special, they are not unique in this respect. Other places like Franconia Notch and Mount Mansfield are dealing with this exact same thing. And I want to thank everyone, especially Rocky, Jackie, Seth, Ryan, Carolyn, Maggie, Brianna, Brittany, and Delaney. And thank you, Julia. And I know Kayla's out there, so thanks to her. And that's it. I'm going to unshare, Julia.
Yes, please. Great. Well, thank you, Jill and Heidi, for those really exciting, sharing your exciting findings. And thank you for posting. We have lots of questions coming in to our Q&A. So why don't I start? And we'll start with this question. There were a number of questions about where surveying was taking place, and relatedly, what attempts were made to capture hikers who were displaced from the high peaks because of COVID and crowding. So Heidi, maybe you could address that first, and then Jill, if you want to throw in your answer as well.
Sure. Thanks, Julia. Yeah, we had 33 trailheads. I'm trying to remember the number of trails that actually went into the high peaks. We had a lot of trails that were north of Saranac Lake, over in the Tupper Lake area, down in the Jay Mountain area. So we actually have a pretty diverse sample of hikers who were hiking places that don't necessarily lead to a high peak. However, we did not ask explicitly why they chose to go to that trail versus the high peaks. We did ask about motivations, and we haven't actually looked at that data or parsed it out in terms of, you know, kind of these like more high intensity use trails versus the more low intensity use trails. And the other thing I'll say is, you know, we went into this thinking, okay, well, we'll try to go to places that are really highly used and some places that are not as highly used, but then they ended up being like almost all highly used. And of course, like Adirondack Lodge and Cascade are their own, you know, outliers of intense, incredible use. But then every other place that we went to had just a lot of use. There were just a few handful of trails where our enumerator said, yeah, we didn't see anybody today, or maybe we just saw one person. There was just a few that were like that. So we still have a little bit of work to do to look at, you know, people's motivations for going to those places versus, you know, some of these other ones.
I won't go to this slide, but I'll just rattle off our sites: Ampersand, AMR, Cascade, Elk Lake, Heart Lake, Marcy Field, Rooster Combe, Round Pond, Seward, The Garden, Upper Works. These were areas that are popular quote unquote, and in reality. And also they interested our partners. So that was our motivation. I'll end it there.
Great, thank you. On a related question, do either of you have anything that you can address about some of the folks who aren't coming and why they're not coming related to race? So Joe Henderson is wondering, Jill, specifically about the racial composition of your sample, and if you can speak to that at all. Jill, go ahead. You're muted right now, though. Oh, you're muted, Jill.
I lost my Zoom window for a second because something else was up. Sorry about that. The question and answer thing kind of came up. I did not go into detail about racial composition, but I do have that information. Essentially, 92% of the recreational users identified as white, followed by 2% Hispanic or Latinx, then 3% prefer not to answer, 1% Black or African American, 1% identified as other, 1% identified as Pacific Islander, 0% African, Asian, Native American. Breaking down the non-white respondents, I'd say, again, the majority, and there are only 15 of them, were Hispanic or Latinx, followed by 8 that were other. And your question is why? I think that is actually another talk, because I could talk about this for hours. I think we all could. I think it's a matter of what people perceive as safe spaces, and also what people's motivations are. During a pandemic, do you necessarily want to go someplace you've never been, where you're not quite sure that or you might not be getting the message that you're welcome, or that you'll know your way around, or that you'll feel safe? And I think that we all need to work harder to make these spaces that we love feel safe for everybody. I don't know if I'm answering your question that well, but that's the data that I have. And if I can find a student that wants to run with this, I'd like to work with a couple of organizations that are at work in the Adirondack on this issue, and do more with it.
Great, thanks, Jill. Heidi, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
We collected information on race and ethnicity, but we haven't gotten into analyzing that data. Just thinking through what Jill said, I believe our stats are fairly similar, and we did not ask any questions, and I don't know of anybody who has done any research of individuals who maybe want to visit the Adirondacks but have decided not to because of whatever reason. I think that's a whole area of inquiry that is wide open.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question, and I'm jumping around here in the questions a little bit, but it looks like we have a question from Pete Pettengill. He said 59% of respondents support limits when wilderness ecology is being degraded. Were there any questions asking people if they agreed or disagreed that the conditions were actually degraded?
Is that a question for me?
I believe so, Jill.
I think so. Okay, sure. Our partners, we agreed to keep the survey short. To answer your question, we want to run with that. I'd say now that we know that people have this willingness, right, that they know that the degradation is in existence, that this is something we need to drill down on. So we did not ask any follow-up questions. We just asked this. But essentially what this survey did was really create multiple research agendas. Hopefully that's helpful.
We asked about people's perceptions of quality during the pre-hike survey, so not in the post-hike survey, because we were looking, at a slightly different set of questions related to support for behaviors and management that would impact wildlife specifically. So we were just more concerned about, what they thought of the quality of the place that they were going to. And then we had them, do this citizen science project for some of the people who were part of the experimental design. So we don't have any of that data looked at yet, but we might have some insights on that coming up.
Thanks. Okay, this is a question for Heidi. This is from Pete Nelson. He says he was interested in your selection of questions related to the likelihood of pro-conservation actions. Is there a reason that you didn't include a question about voting behavior?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, it's, you know, we wanted to have a set of conservation behaviors that were very specific to the Adirondacks and also potentially specific to kind of wildlife. And there's not a lot of opportunity to vote specifically on wildlife, and kind of that voting, the voting question that you see in a lot of different places is actually like broader, like, you know, will you vote for candidates that support conservation? And we just felt that that was a little bit too broad. So, and also in the interest of limiting the number of questions, we eliminated that one.
Great, thanks, Heidi. And then another question, and I think this is fair for both of you. Do you have any comment on sample bias? Because your sample consisted of hikers who were able to hike. So what about the folks who weren't able to get there?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we don't we don't know what we don't know about the people who didn't show up. Even, I mean, we actually did a for people that we intercepted and they said, no, I don't want to take a survey right now. We actually asked them 3 questions as kind of a non-respondent bias that we could compare with the people who responded, but that's still not the same. That's not addressing the same bias as Pete raises here, which is there are a lot of people out there that don't go hiking for whatever their reasons are, and we don't know what they think. And I'm not sure what the sampling frame would be to ask that, unless we did like a larger New York State survey and tried to find people who don't hike.
Great, thanks, Jill.
I have an idea for the next survey now that I've got this McIntyre Stennis grant. Like, for example, both the Adirondack Mountain Club and AMC have publications and have email lists that include non-members. And it might be an opportunity to reach out to people who want to hike but aren't hiking, and you know, they're curious about hiking but not getting out there. We might have a way to reach out to that population. But I also think that we, as I said in the previous question, we can try harder to reach out to organizations that represent not this population and ask them what their interests are as far as access and these activities.
Thank you. So let's see, we have a lot of questions that are related to future actions. So Heidi, why don't I start with this question of, are there ways to encourage or nudge the COVID hikers towards more conservation behaviors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm not sure of anybody who's actually looked at that specifically around COVID hikers or people that have changed their behaviors because of the COVID pandemic, but it's certainly, I mean, there's certainly a lot of research, large bodies of research on like, how do you get somebody to go from kind of no conservation actions to some conservation actions? And it would certainly be worthwhile to kind of amass that information and try to figure out like, how should we be approaching or managing or thinking about outreach with these groups of people who are coming in new to this area that maybe have not been here before, that maybe have no place attachment, that we can kind of steward a conservation ethic in. So that's open for lots of work on that.
Thanks. Jill, is there any comment that you wanted to add to that? Okay. And then what are, there are a lot of questions coming in about management implications. So why don't I just open this up and ask, what do you think the management implications of your findings are first? And the second question, how do you think what you found, what does it tell us about how research should influence management here in the Adirondack Park? Anyone want to hop on that first?
Heidi, do you want to go? You're unmuted.
Okay, so how should research influence management in the Adirondacks? I mean, I've been doing research in the Adirondacks for 20 years, and I have always felt that the more information that we have, the better. The more to improve the dialogue, the better to know what we're dealing with, as opposed to just guessing and anecdotes. And I think that, you know, both of us are at the state of, you know, a lot of our findings are preliminary and we haven't worked them up completely, but this is a huge opportunity for providing some insights that may actually be able to help make some decisions or just move the needle a little bit in by the managers, who will feel a little bit more confident in their decisions because they have information that's backing them. So I think that that's of paramount importance.
Thank you, Heidi.
And I guess the other one was, what does my research specifically mean for management? And I just, I'm really excited about seeing in the Adirondacks that, yes, that place attachment and knowledge do relate to this kind of pro-conservation behaviors. And, you know, we're going to look at that again also for management actions. And I think that's really key. And how do we instill kind of a sense of place for our visitors, especially our new ones, and thinking about kind of the whole diversity issue. I mean, that's huge as New York moves towards a majority minority population, and we look at these numbers of people who are hiking in this area and how skewed it is towards white. We have to think, like, how are we going to make a space that is inclusive, where place attachment exists for the people who aren't here right now? How do we create that space? I think that's going to be a really important management question going forward.
Building off of what Heidi said, I agree. I think place attachment also means lots of different things. We have a huge opportunity here to further enrich the literature on that subject. And, you know, what does hiking mean? We don't want to become a bunch of people telling people to get off my lawn, right? That is not the goal here when we're welcoming people to these shared spaces that we all kind of own, right? It's a state park. But I also want to say that occupying that midworld between academia and practicality, I think, is really essential. And it doesn't make the research any less valuable because it's useful. And I think it can be useful in both directions. And in my earlier dissertation work, I really studied this idea of on-the-ground practice, going back and influencing theory, how it can enrich and enhance theory. And that's what I'd love to see. I also think, getting back to the root question that we were asked about these management actions, I'm so glad we're starting to ask these questions. We have the opportunity, the people here in this meeting and the people we know, to start thinking about this park's future next year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. Thinking about what this park is beyond our lifetime should be part of the conversation. So keeping the dialogue open and transparent, having more participatory processes, that's what I think this will help with. That's what I want to see.
Great, thank you, Jill. That is a great and hopeful place to end this conversation today. I want to thank Jill Weiss and Heidi Kretser for sharing your research, for sharing this time this morning, and I want to thank the Adirondack Research Consortium for hosting this series. For those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, please know that we will try to get those posted on the website afterwards. Yes, thank you so much.